The second drawbridge groans on its chains. And then it falls. A roar erupts from 10,000 throats at once as Parisians in the July heat surge through the gate of the Bastille. Cannons still smoking. A small white handkerchief fluttering from the ramparts above. And somewhere inside that crowd, a cobbler from the Rue Saint-Antoine tightens his grip on a borrowed pike and realizes the impossible has just happened. Welcome back to History Recreated. Today, we're not telling you the story of a battle. We're telling you about the afternoon ordinary people looked at the most powerful monarchy in Europe and decided it was finished. The 14th of July, 1789, the fall of the Bastille, the spark that set the modern world alight. Silk against starvation, powdered wigs against bare feet, and a king who never once saw the wall he was walking toward, until the wall walked back. To understand what happened that morning, you have to look at France in the years just before it, because 1789 wasn't an explosion out of nowhere. It was the end of a very, very long fuse. 12 miles southwest of Paris, the Palace of Versailles was a universe unto itself. Louis XIV had built it in the 1660s for one very specific reason: to lift the French nobility out of their regional power bases and gather them, gilded and perfumed and harmless, inside a single magnificent cage. By the reign of Louis XVI and his Austrian queen, Marie Antoinette, around 20,000 people lived inside that cage. Courtiers, servants, officials, all orbiting the royal apartments in a daily theatre of ceremony that served one purpose: to remind everyone, every hour of every day, that the king answered only to God. And honestly, when you read the details of life at Versailles, it's difficult to process as a real place. Every morning, hundreds of nobles competed for the privilege of handing Louis his dressing gown, his shirt, his shoes. Human furniture, arranged in a human room, for a human king they believed to be partly divine. Court ladies wore silk gowns in 4 and 5 layers, pale rose, powder blue, colors that only existed in the glow of 800 candles. Towering white wigs, faces painted with lead-based powder. In her first year as queen, Marie Antoinette, 23 years old, raised in Vienna with almost no preparation for French politics, spent, on dresses alone, the equivalent of a French laborer's entire lifetime of wages. Sit with that for a moment. One woman, one wardrobe, 1 year, an ordinary person's whole working life. Now turn away from Versailles, cross those 12 miles, and step into Paris. The working-class quarters, the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, the Faubourg Saint-Marcel, were narrow, ancient, dark. Buildings leaned so close overhead that the sky was just a pale ribbon of grey above the lane. The ground was mud, and worse. 600,000 people were pressed into a medieval city whose sanitation belonged to another century. The smell was constant. The noise was constant. And by the summer of 1789, the hunger was constant too. France's economy had been hollowed out for years, drained by 2 disastrous wars, crippled by aristocratic tax exemptions that pushed almost the entire cost of the state onto the people who could least afford it. Then came a savage harvest failure in 1788 that drove the price of bread to its highest point in a generation. A skilled Paris worker earned about 30 sous a day. A 4-pound loaf of bread now cost 14. Just stop for a second and sit with that number, half your income, every single day, just to not go hungry. Nothing left for rent, nothing left for shoes, nothing left for the small dignities that make a life feel like a life. And underneath that arithmetic, something was beginning to smolder. Not quite rage yet, something colder. something steadier. The political situation finished the job. Louis XVI, well-meaning, indecisive, a man who preferred hunting and tinkering with locks to running a country, convened the Estates General in May of 1789, the first time that body had been called since 1614. The goal was to fix the finances. Instead, it became the match. The Third Estate, the commoners, 97% of the population, facing constant obstruction from the clergy and nobility, who together owned most of the land and paid almost none of the tax, declared themselves a National Assembly on the 17th of June. They would write a constitution with or without the king's permission. Louis locked their meeting hall. So they moved to a nearby indoor tennis court and swore, in front of one another and before God, that they would not go home until France had a constitution. And here is the part that always amazes me. The king blinked. He accepted the assembly. For a few bright days, Paris felt something close to joy. Then, on the 11th of July, everything turned. Louis dismissed Jacques Necker, his finance minister, the one royal official the common people actually trusted, the one voice inside the palace who seemed to understand that France could not carry on as it was. The news reached Paris the next day like a thunderclap. A young journalist named Camille Desmoulins leapt onto a café table outside the Palais Royal, tore a green leaf from the chestnut tree above him. "Green," he shouted, "the colour of hope," and warned the gathering crowd that a royal crackdown was coming. They believed him. They had every reason to. Royal cavalry had charged a peaceful gathering in the Tuileries Gardens that very afternoon. That night, the city's customs posts were set ablaze. 52 wagons of grain were taken from a church warehouse and hauled to the public market. This was no longer a riot. It had a plan. By the morning of the 14th of July, 30,000 muskets had been carried out of the armory at the Hôtel des Invalides. 30,000 weapons and almost no gunpowder. Then a rumour rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat. 250 barrels of gunpowder had just been moved to the Bastille, 2 miles to the east. Armed, organised and absolutely certain, the crowd rolled several small cannons into line and began the march east. Drums ahead. Pikes and muskets bobbing above the shoulders of 1,000 angry people. Shutters along the route cracking open, then slamming shut again. They arrived at the Bastille around 11 in the morning. And here is the detail nobody expects. In strict military terms, the Bastille was already a ruin. 82 elderly veterans, 32 Swiss grenadiers, 7 prisoners inside, 4 forgers, 2 men struggling with mental illness, and a young aristocrat whose own family had requested his confinement. The building had already been scheduled for demolition. The government had plans to replace it with a park. But to the people of Paris, it was never just a building. For over a century, every midnight arrest, every sealed royal warrant that could make a man vanish into a cell without trial had attached itself to the image of those 8 towers. The Bastille wasn't a prison. It was the physical body of absolute power, and they wanted it down. Negotiations began. 3 delegations from the city government walked through the gates and spoke with the governor, Bernard-René de Launay, a man who had actually been born inside the Bastille itself, who had never known another home, and whose orders were to hold it at any cost. De Launay pulled his cannons back from the battlements as a gesture of good faith. The trouble was, nobody told the crowd outside in time. 2 men scrambled up the outer wall and cut the chains of the first drawbridge. It crashed down, and part of the crowd surged into the inner courtyard, certain that the fortress had opened itself to them. When the panicking garrison fired from above, those in the courtyard believed they had been lured into a trap. For 4 hours, 4 solid hours of smoke, shouted orders, neighbors pulling injured neighbors back from the gate, and wave after wave of people pressing forward through the outer courtyard, the crowd held its ground. Think about that for a moment. These are not professional soldiers. These are bakers and laundresses and printers, people who had woken up that morning worried about the price of bread and who were now holding a line under cannon fire. And then, around 3 in the afternoon, the entire story turned on a single detail. Mutinous companies of the French Guard, professional soldiers who had refused to fire on civilians, marched up from the city with 5 field cannons and aimed them directly at the main gate. Pierre-Augustin Hulin, a veteran of the American Revolutionary War, took command and gave the order. Delaunay looked at his situation. No reinforcements, the main gate minutes from splintering 30,000 pounds of gunpowder directly beneath his feet, and for a moment seriously considered lighting the powder and taking the entire fortress and the surrounding neighborhood with him. His own soldiers refused. He raised a white handkerchief above the ramparts. The second drawbridge came down. The crowd swept in. The 7 prisoners were carried out into the daylight, blinking and bewildered, accidental symbols of a liberation whose meaning they could barely grasp. The gunpowder was seized, and Delaunay himself, escorted toward the city under a promise of safety, was taken from his escort by the crowd in the street. He did not come home. That evening, Thomas Jefferson, then serving as American ambassador to France, a man who had quite literally been walking the streets of Paris all week just to watch history happen, sat down and wrote a letter. The events, he said, were astonishing. The king, he reported, had gone in person to the National Assembly, almost without escort, almost to apologize. And here is the part that still moves me every time. The cobbler from the Rue Saint-Antoine went home that night. His children were still hungry, bread was still expensive. One afternoon had not rebuilt the world. But something had shifted in the air of Paris. Something in the way people held their shoulders in the street, in the sudden, almost physical knowledge that it was possible. The towers could fall, the drawbridge could come down, and ordinary people, tired, muddy, furious, and so often ignored, could reach out, press their hands against the wall of the world, and feel it move. The revolution had only just begun. If history told from the cobblestones up, from the hunger out, from the inside of the crowd, is the kind of storytelling you want more of, then you've found your home. I'm genuinely curious about something, and I want you to tell me in the comments, which single afternoon in history would you want to stand inside just for a few hours and watch unfold with your own eyes? Drop it below. Tap that subscribe button so History Recreated can find its way back to you. And next time, we'll step into that afternoon together.